Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. So what I've got here is an Excel dashboard. There's nothing fancy here. This is pretty standard Excel features, no plugins, no custom coding. You probably have all the skills to build this right now, and if you don't believe me, I'll prove it to you throughout the video. It's just applying your skills in maybe a new or different way. And this is all built using this small collection of sample data. And I just want to talk a little bit and give some tips on coming up with what visualizations to use when you have a small set of data. You don't need much data to create really useful, actionable, insightful dashboards. But a lot of times people just get stuck because they see the table and they go, how does this table translate into a visualization? What should I highlight? What shouldn't I highlight? All of that. So I just want to walk you through how I do it because I think that is one of the most effective ways to learn this skill. It can be a little confusing, but seeing somebody else do it can help quite a bit. So let's just jump right in here. We've got monthly data here. So we got a time series. And when you see a time series, typically the easiest thing for you to use as a visualization is going to be a time series chart. That could be a line chart, a bar chart. Those are kind of the standard options and where you should start. Line charts are great when you have more subtle variations. Bar charts are great when you have bigger variations, but there's also a lot of nuance to choosing which one. Choose the one that works for you in your context. Don't worry too much about getting it right. We also have a little thing here where there's a metric, in this case revenue, and a revenue target that's broken down by just a few dimensions. So we've got it broken down by online, mobile, online, desktop, and in-store. So when you see something like this with just three, let's say less than 5 or less than 10 segments, some of the charts that kind of fit something like this might be a donut or pie chart. I've got one here. A lot of people don't like donut or pie charts. I disagree. I think they're appropriate in lots of different situations, but that's a bigger discussion. And then the other thing I sometimes think about when I see this is something like a horizontal bar chart like this, where you can see the difference really easily across the segment size. So our brain is a lot better at seeing the difference between these bars than it is at seeing the difference between the size of slices, which is why sometimes people don't like donut charts. So this is a great way to show that difference in scale between different metrics. And then of course we've got some geodata here. You see geodata, you probably think a map of some kind. In this case, that's exactly what we've done. That's an easy one. Maps are not always the most useful. They're not always the most actionable, but I have tested across many, many dashboards that I've made. And for whatever reason, people love geocharts and they get engagement, and they are sometimes the shiny object you have to dangle in front of somebody to get them to come in and use the more actionable metrics in the rest of your dashboard. So I often encourage people to use them just as a way of increasing engagement. Even if that's all it does, that is sometimes enough. Okay, great. So we have some ideas for visualizations to use, but we first have to step back and think a little bit about overall strategy. What are we trying to accomplish here? What story are we trying to tell with our data? What are we trying to communicate with our data? And because this is kind of fake made up data, it's a little tricky, but in this case, I'm imagining that this is like a sales dashboard. We are thinking about sales, but we're trying to put those sales in context. In this case, we have sales and revenue mixed together, but I'm just going to primarily say that sales is the core focus. That's kind of the top of our narrative pyramid, if you think of it in those terms. And then beneath it are things that are kind of helping you dive deeper and understand more and more about what that number means. So when we say, hey, this is going to focus on sales, we got to put a sales metric in there, sure, but what do we use for that? Do we use the total sales across the whole year? Do we use sales across the quarter? Do we use the most recent number? That really depends on your organization, whatever you're doing. I'm going to pretend that this is like a monthly report. So I want to grab the most recent data reported, the most recent month, in this case December. So I've just written a little thing up here that points down to the most recent month and pulls it in. And then here, what I've done is you go under insert, you just throw a rectangle in there, make that rectangle transparent, and then click into your formula bar while the rectangle's selected, and you can point it at whatever data you want, and it'll show up there. That's how I get that metric onto this page in the way that you see it here. But that metric is really important, right? This is the focal point. This is our most important metric on the page. So how do we know that? There's two ways that I'm accentuating that metric here. First one, big text. It's the biggest text on the page, so your eyes are drawn to it. That's the first one. Second one, placement on the page. Upper left. If you're in an English-speaking country or many Western countries, you read from top left to the right and then down to the right, down to the right, right? So you're going from top left to bottom right. So your top left is prime real estate to put something that's very important. In this case, it's big and it's in the top left. That's where your eyes typically are drawn to first. I also know that consistently people look at a metric and they say, hey, I love this metric, but I need to have context of where it came from. So I often then will also calculate how much has that changed from the previous period and include that as well. So in this case, I've just done a little calculation. How much has the metric changed? And I've dropped that in there. So you see that it's gone up $11,100 since the previous period. If somebody wants to go a little bit deeper, I've also added this chart beneath, which charts the whole thing so that you can get into the nuanced, context of how this is changed over the previous year. Okay, we've got our top metric here. I've got a geo chart next to it. The geo chart this is a pretty precious piece of real estate. It's still at the top of the page. It's not the top left, but it's still high on the page. Now, some people see this and they say, oh, that's just a waste of a really important section. But I disagree. This geo chart is going to grab people's attention. It frankly just looks cool. And it is somewhat insightful to see how your sales break down by region, but it's not super helpful because we can't filter this whole dashboard down to that individual region. So really, in this case, it's a somewhat useful insight, but a much more useful tool for engagement. Then I've said, okay, so secondary breakdown, what other metrics do I want to get in here? In this case, we've got these revenue metrics that I'm tossing in. In this case, I'm showing lifetime revenue, just in case somebody needs to have that bigger picture. I'm going monthly average, so what is the breakdown per month? In this case, I believe, this is C4, we're showing monthly average revenue. So I need to label this data a little more clearly, actually. That's an important note here. But maybe somebody wants to know how far above or below the average am I in this current period? And then, as I mentioned before, we've tracked it over time. So what I'm thinking here is somebody can go, they can look and they say, hey, here's where I'm at right now. Here's where I'm at as a running total in terms of the lifetime amount of money earned across the whole period that's in this report. And here's how it has changed and fluctuated over time. That is kind of like each level of insight that you need to really look at this data and understand it in context. To the right of this, I've put in gross margin. Gross margin is not the focus of this report, but it's also useful context. So I've included it using a similar methodology to sales, but taking up a lot less real estate, a lot less of the page, just to give a sense of the fact that this has gone from negative gross margin to positive gross margin. Because I think even though you see a gross margin and we say, hey, it's 30,000, okay, that's great, you really want to have context of the fact that that is much lower than this peak and much higher than it previously was when it was negative for a period of time. So you're able to kind of extrapolate that pretty easily by just including two metrics and a simple bar chart. Then we get into this revenue breakdown. So I've included a pie chart here. And in this case, I've just included percentages so that you have a sense of percentage breakdown. I think that's useful sometimes just in context of conversation. Hey, what do we want to focus on? Well, 60% of our revenue comes from online desktop, so let's focus on that, right? It gives framing for that conversation. But percentage doesn't necessarily give us a sense of what those numbers actually are. So next to it, seemingly somewhat redundant, is a horizontal bar chart showing the same data, but with monthly totals, or excuse me, with totals instead of percentages, and plotting a secondary metric, and this is revenue target. So this just gives you a sense, are we over our revenue target or under our revenue target for each channel that's shown here, in-store, online desktop, and online mobile. So let's stop and take a big breath here. I've walked you through choosing some basic visualizations here and explained a little bit about how I think of those visualizations. Some of these probably aren't totally clear to you. You're like, well, I kind of see how you chose that, but it doesn't totally make sense to me. What I encourage you to do is try doing something similar to this with some of your own data. because you understand the context of your own data probably better than anyone else, and you know how that data is actually going to be used. So try applying the same exercise to your own data and hone in on whatever the actual use case is for you. Showing a bunch of data doesn't help unless that data can be used to inform a decision. It can be actionable in some way, it can give some useful insight, right? You know what those useful insights are for you and your organization. So do your own version of this with keeping that in mind and making your choices with that in mind. And it might become a little bit clearer how you make some of these choices of the specific visualizations or the specific metrics. Anyway, I hope that helps. I hope that was useful for everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you want templates like this one, this actually came from the newsletter. You can join the newsletter. I'll put a link below where I send these out for free every month, sometimes a few times a month. And if you have any questions, comments, anything like that, let me know below. Happy to engage with everyone, answer questions. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Really appreciate it. And I will have more content coming soon with more fun Excel dashboards. See ya.